Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Canada launch of the Global Terrorism Index. My name is Jessica Duque, Outreach and Development Officer with the Institute for Economics and Peace. We're delighted to be joined with today's co-hosts, the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies and the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. The Global Terrorism Index is produced annually by the Institute for Economics and Peace, and the report aims to be the most comprehensive resource on global terrorism trends. Key sections in this year's report include analysis on the impact of COVID-19, increased terrorism in the Sahel, ideological trends in the West, and an analysis of conflict as the primary driver of terrorism. In today's event, we are excited to present key findings from the 2022 report and engage in discussion over how this research may align with the current landscape of counterterrorism analysis and intervention. The report's launch coincided with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I want to recognize that many of us have this conflict at the forefront in our minds, and we may be wondering how this will not only affect current trends in terrorism, but also the state of international peace and security as a whole. To help ground us in this conversation we'll be having today on the Global Terrorism Index, I'm pleased to be joined by the Honorable Chris Alexander, former Canadian Minister of Immigration and Citizenship and former Canadian Ambassador to Afghanistan. The findings of the GTI will be presented by Michael Collins, Executive Director of the Americas at the Institute for Economics and Peace. And following his presentation, we will hear reflections from two other expert panelists, Besma Momani, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation, and Professor at the University of Waterloo, as well as Kyle Matthews, Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. Today's session will also include audience Q&A, so I encourage you to share your questions and thoughts in the chat function of your respective live stream platform. We're going to do a little bit of switch in terms of the agenda today, so I'd like to start by handing the floor over to Michael Collins, who will lead us with the findings of the Global Terrorism Index.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jessica, and thanks again to Migs and the Canadian Global Affairs Institute for partnering with us on this launch. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Excellent. So very quickly about the Institute for Economics and Peace. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute. We're dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, tangible, and achievable measure of human well-being and progress. We do that primarily through quantitative research. Our flagship report is the Global Peace Index. And of course, we'll be talking about the Global Terrorism Index today. We have a number of offices around the world. I'm currently joining you from New York. Our headquarters is in Sydney, Australia, and we have teams in Brussels, The Hague, Mexico City, and Harare. We're thankful that our research is used extensively by multilateral organizations around the world, in universities, and increasingly consulted online, currently in over 150 countries. We develop a number of products that are sort of published annually. I referred very quickly to the Global Peace Index before. We also have the Ecological Threat Register, the Positive Peace Report. All of our reports, as well as our PowerPoint presentations, including the one that you're going to be seeing today, are all available for free on our website, Vision of Humanity. Excellent. So the Global Terrorism Index. So this is a report that we've been doing now for around 8 years. And essentially what it does is it ranks 163 countries according to the relative impact of terrorism. And we're going to go into sort of that definition a tiny bit. It's just one of the 23 different indicators that we use in the Global Peace Index, our flagship product. The overall methodology is developed by IEP, and the GTI includes contributions from international counterterrorism experts. So in terms of the overall methodology, and this is the first year that we're actually using a new database, in this case, the Terrorism Tracker from Dragonfly, which we found to be extremely comprehensive. They specialize, private companies specializing in providing intelligence information for a large array of partners, including the insurance sector. We track a variety of different indicators, as you can see here. So we track incidents, terrorism incidents, injuries, deaths, and hostages, and we provide those with a different weighting. As you can see here, for example, deaths weigh significantly higher than incidents, and by extension, injuries and hostages as well. Another thing that we try and do is we're trying to account for the impact of terrorism over a 5-year period. And that's in an attempt to quantify somewhat the emotional and the political impact that a terrorism attack, may have. We then go through a process of banding, which ensures that the data is globally comparable. And once we've developed that initial ranking, we then bring in a variety of socioeconomic indicators to try and get to some of the underlying drivers of terrorism worldwide. So let's jump straight into the results for this year. This is a large mud map of the results. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time on sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel today. As you can see here, areas that have been significantly impacted by terrorism, as well as South Asia and Asia Pacific in the case of Myanmar. This is kind of sort of a visual readout of all of the terrorist attacks, and the circles, of course, indicate the actual size of the attack, so you can develop a slightly better feel for terrorism worldwide. And if we jump straight into the highlights, I mean, one of the things that we see is that the number of deaths from terrorism is actually down. And that's something that has been similar for the last 4 years. But the actual number of attacks has actually increased relatively significantly over the last year. So overall, we kind of sort of say that terrorism has become less lethal in 2020. Perhaps an indication of the fact that terrorism is somewhat becoming a bit less sophisticated. And we'll delve into this a bit more too. Overall, we see that 86 countries improved compared to 19 that deteriorated. And we've seen also that terrorism is becoming more concentrated in conflict zones, primarily in 5 to 10 countries. In fact, 97% of all attacks occur in countries with various degrees of conflict. Now, the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa more broadly is now becoming the epicenter of terrorism. Deaths are up 10 times over the last decade, and 43% of all attacks globally happened in the Sahel in 2021. Notwithstanding, though, the actual deaths in the sub-Saharan region, which includes the Sahel, decreased by 10%. That was largely due to counter-terrorism initiatives in Nigeria, in the case of Boko Haram, and in Mozambique. The deaths in MENA continued to decline. Terrorism continued to improve. The MENA had somewhat been the hotspot of terrorism from 2014, 15, 16, but that has gradually continued to improve as it has deteriorated in sub-Saharan Africa. The Islamic State and its affiliates are the most deadly group, now covering over 20 countries around the world. And Jainim, largely based in the Sahel, Jamaat Nasrul Islam wal Muslim, is the fastest growing group. Now, it's relatively still small compared to other organizations, the Islamic State and the Taliban and Al-Shabaab included, but is growing significantly fast. So an area of attention too. And ISWA, which is the Islamic State of West Africa, is the most lethal. As an example, in Niger, 23 attacks with an average deaths of 15 people per attack. Now, interestingly, one of the things that we see is that, over half of all of the terrorist attacks worldwide are not ascribed to a particular group, indication perhaps or evidence in some ways of the fact that terrorist attacks are increasingly perpetrated by individuals with no distinct affiliation to terrorist groups. We see that the attacks in the West have fallen substantially for the last 4 years, and certain sub-elements within that have fallen because of COVID, although we have seen that COVID hasn't had a significant impact, at least from the data that we have on terrorism until now. And in the West, one of the things that we have seen, which we'll jump into a tiny bit more, is the fact that politically motivated terrorism has now overtaken religious terrorism. Myanmar had the largest increase in terrorism in 2021, and Mozambique recorded the largest drop, again, largely due to counterterrorism efforts down there. So these are the countries most impacted by terrorism in the report this year. Afghanistan continues to be the country most impacted by terrorism. 3 of the 5 deadliest attacks last year were in Afghanistan. The most deadly attack was the attack in Kabul airport, perpetrated by the Khorasan chapter of ISIS. All of these countries, as you can see, are in some form of conflict. So if we have a look at this chart, which is I always kind of sort of find both fascinating and depressing at the same time, if we look at the left-hand column, we see a significant percentage of terrorist deaths happening in essentially 5 countries: Afghanistan, Burkina Faso, Somalia, Mali, and Niger. And now if we look into 2021, this last year, more than half of the deaths globally are in these particular countries. So we've seen that the deaths fall in all of the other countries around the world. So, by extension, we've seen terrorism becoming progressively more concentrated in these countries, particularly as it pertains to their level of conflict. So if we look at sort of the impact of terrorism per region, the sub-Saharan Africa region is the only one that actually deteriorated last year. Now, that's not to say that there weren't deteriorations of specific countries within other regions. For example, in the case of Myanmar and Indonesia, in the Asia Pacific, Greece and Netherlands in Europe, Algeria in the MENA region, and 4 South American countries as well. But it's interesting to note nonetheless. This is kind of sort of a slightly larger breakout of the 10 countries with the largest number of deaths from terrorism. As you can see, 10 countries account for 85% of all deaths from terrorism in 2021. In the case of Afghanistan, it deteriorated both in the number of deaths and the number of incidents as well. So in terms of the countries that had the largest increase in deaths over the last year, Myanmar, significant, largely targeting the military and the government, and as noted here, significant increase in the Sahel region, specifically in Niger and Mali. And Peru kind of sort of makes it into this list as perhaps somebody who you wouldn't immediately expect, with a single terrorist attack that took the lives of 16 people there. So if we look at the flip side of that and we look at the largest decreases in terrorism, we mentioned Mozambique before, as well as Nigeria. The death of Abu Bakr Shakau and redistribution and ongoing counterterrorism efforts there, we think have had a significant impact in that respect. And then jumping straight into trends in terrorism. So this obviously covers since 2007, and this is somewhat of a sort of an unfair chart in some respects because it batches together regions and countries, but it's quite interesting nonetheless. Specifically, you can look at the green region here, which represents the Sahel, and how it's significantly expanded over the last 3 to 4 years. And, something that never ceases to fascinate me somewhat is, despite all the attention we pay to terrorism in Europe and North Africa, the West, for lack of a better word, the overall percentage in terrorism is not only extremely small, but has been decreasing significantly over the last 5 years. So talking specifically about terrorist groups, in this case, the most deadliest terrorist group in 2021 is the Islamic State, followed by Al-Shabaab, then the Taliban and Jainim. Now, again, Jainim is generally relatively small, as you can see here on the chart on the left-hand side, this little cream-colored sliver here, so to speak, but has seen significant growth over the last year or 2. So this is terrorism broken down by the 3 main regions mostly impacted by terrorism. As you can see here, the MENA region, which for a number of years had been the epicenter of terrorism, was overtaken by both South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa from 2017 onwards. Now, a shifting landscape, primarily in relation to the Islamic State. What we see is over the last, 5 to 7 years, a significant increase in the number of countries in which the Islamic State is able to operate, largely through both sort of formal provinces and loosely affiliated chapters. We did see a slight improvement, so to speak, in 2021, but nonetheless still significant over 20 countries. If we look at sort of the distribution of Islamic State activities, we see the significant drop of its activities in the MENA region. Obviously, the end of the war in Iraq and Syria, or at least the end of their kind of sort of territorial control and their shift, in this case, as you can see, to both South Asia, or the growth of the Khorasan chapter in Afghanistan specifically, but more importantly, their growth in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, kind of sort of focusing in on terrorism in the Sahel. One of the things that we see is that both incidents and deaths in the Sahel have increasingly grown, essentially, over the last decade. We, see this kind of sort of drops in deaths here on the right-hand side. We're not able to pinpoint that exclusively, but we suspect it's largely due to successful counterterrorism efforts, but perhaps, not enough efforts to be able to curb terrorism in its totality. Here we see sort of the rise of JNIM, for example. So obviously a lot of underlying issues there that haven't necessarily been tackled. As another indication of this, for example, the exponential increase of kidnappings that we've seen in the Sahel, especially since 2017, as you can see here. This, in many ways can be interpreted as a broader kind of sort of indication of the lack of stability and security in the countries that no doubt a number of you will be a lot more familiar with than I am. This is overlapping the number of terrorist attacks and deaths on top of results from IEP's Ecological Threat report. Now, in that report, what we do is we try and we essentially score and rank countries actually sub-administratively, so at the state or at the provincial level, based on a variety of elements related to ecological threats. So, for example, increasing food insecurity, increasing water stress, natural disasters, population growth, rising temperatures. And we do see a distinct overlap between water and food scarcity, for example, and increasing levels of terrorism. As you can see here, 8 out of the 10 countries in the Sahel rank in the bottom half of the ecological threat report, largely related to food and water risk. At the same time, it's important to note, for example, that population growth can and perhaps will play a significant role over the next 30 years. As you can see on the right-hand side, this column here represents sort of the percentage of expected population growth in those areas. Now, it's not to say that those areas are necessarily any more, dense, so to speak, than any other ones, but given the significant food and water shortages that we are seeing, as well as the lack of security, there is potential for an increased risk of terrorism in these locations. Niger specifically seeing a rise of 161% in population over the next 30 years. Now, terrorism in the West, and I think this is the second to last section. This kind of sort of chart pretty much talks about it all in some respects. And of course, if you'd like to go into it in more detail, there's significantly more in the report. But overall, we see this kind of sort of increase in terrorism. And when I talk about the West, I talk about North America, primarily the United States and Canada, Europe and Oceania, primarily Australia and New Zealand. We've seen this increase and decrease in terrorism rising in 2015, 16 and beyond, and then a decrease over the last 3 years. This kind of sort of increase and decrease as it pertains, for example, to separatist terrorism attacks, increase and decrease and steady decrease in terms of religious attacks, for example, and even in the case of far-right attacks as well. Now, one of the things that we see in terms of far-left attacks is not only that increase in 2016, 2017, as levels of polarization worldwide increase, but the number of incidents has actually continued to be relatively high for far left. Now, the situation is somewhat different, specifically in the United States and Canada, but taking into account sort of the broader West, so to speak, especially Europe, with regards to far left, we see significantly more incidents that are related to far left terrorism. At the same time, it should be acknowledged that these are usually non-lethal and relatively small. So, for example, if we look over the last decade, religious terrorism has been significantly more lethal and responsible for most deaths, followed by far-right terrorism. Far-left terrorism that you see here on the right-hand side isn't exactly zero, but it is extremely small. And overall, one of the things I mentioned in the beginning is the fact that political terrorism, both far-right and far-left, has overtaken religious terrorism over the last 5 years. There were only 3 Islamist attacks in Europe in 2021. Sorry, only is completely the wrong word. I use it again here, but it is to say that there has been an improvement in this particular domain. And again, in the United States, for example, there were no terrorist attacks that were attributed to a specific group. It's becoming increasingly difficult to kind of sort of really untangle incidents or terrorist attacks perpetrated by either far left or far right groups, both in the US and in the broader West. And that's because increasingly the targets, for example, of these attacks are very similar in the case of the government, and also the underlying motivations, alienation from the system and a frustration with the system as it exists, relates very much to both of these. And then lastly, I believe, and referred to by Jessica very briefly in the beginning, this correlation between terrorist attacks by conflict type. I talked about before how 97% of terrorist attacks occur in countries embroiled in conflict. As you can see here, nearly half in countries that are at outright war, the other half in countries with minor conflicts. And we see that 80% of terrorist attacks occur within 50 kilometers of an ongoing conflict. So obviously taking into consideration, for example, the situation in the Ukraine right now, and just perhaps thinking about this historically in some respects, you know, the Ukraine and Georgia experienced significant spikes in terrorism during previous wars in 2008 and 2014. So we do expect to see, given these broader correlations that we're seeing, that as the intensity of the war increases in the Ukraine, we are going to see, in conjunction with it, an increase in terrorist incidents, an increase in terrorist deaths as well. One of the things that is increasingly being talked about in the Ukraine, and that we're all seeing the effect of, is cyber attacks. You know, in many ways, what's happening already could be considered to be cyber warfare. There's still a lack of kind of sort of definitions, and the GTI, the GTI doesn't currently account for cyber terrorist attacks, but there's definitely potential and perhaps the need to do so at some point in the future as soon as that becomes viable. Invariably, cyber attacks have spillover effects in other countries, and we have started to sort of see that in a number of countries due to the conflict in Ukraine and Russia. And then lastly, not necessarily a positive note, but something definitely to take into account, which again, a number of you will be familiar with, and that is the fact that terrorist groups are most vulnerable within their first 3 years of existence. So these are kind of sort of 2 different sets taken from 2007 and 2015 that show the significant sort of decrease or the lifespan, essentially, of terrorist groups. Now, one of the things that we also see on the tail end of that is that any terrorist group that is able to get to the 10-year, 12-year mark, usually becoming an insurgent group. In other words, a larger group that's more organized, responsible for more fatalities, has more members, and is even able to, for example, take territorial control, such as ISIS, such as the Taliban, et cetera, then it's incredibly difficult to be able to get rid of these groups. So there's a very small window to be able to be successful of 1 to 3 years. So that's what we're seeing through the data. Of course, a lot to be unpacked there. And experts significantly more informed than I am. So thank you very much, and look forward to hearing our panelists' comments and to the broader discussion.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your presentation. Unfortunately, Minister Chris Alexander hasn't been able to join us just yet, so I want to transition into handing the floor over to our discussants. First to you, Besma, for your initial thoughts and reflections on the findings of the GTI.
Thank you, and thank you for this report. It really is very important for us to obviously measure this. If we don't measure it, if we don't have a sense of where, how, when, we really can't get at the core issues. I've learned a lot from this presentation today already, and I think there are some possibly positive news coming out of all of this misery. The fact that we're seeing that there is improvement in 86 countries, of course, it hasn't gotten better for far others. I'd love to just point out a little bit about some of the key takeaways that I notice, of course, is that this really is about conflict. At the end of the day, unfortunately, terrorism is attracted to conflict, or it produces conflict. In both scenarios, we really need to get at the core of how do we help and think about stopping these conflicts, and think about the root causes of terrorism, of course, is also very important. That's never an excuse for it, but not not really getting at the core of why and what are the drivers, I think is really foolhardy. So I think we have a lot to learn from the statistics that you showed us today. And certainly you've pointed out already a few drivers that are coming to the fore academically increasingly, like climate change. This is very much a concerning issue because so many of these countries are already at great risk of scarcity of resources, of course, food, and that, of course, will lead to pressures of migration. And we know that, of course, in the end, that means more political conflict over scarce resources. Thank you for pointing out cyber. I think this is something that we need to increasingly think about. Cyber attacks are going to increase. I think many of us who are watching this space are holding our breath because we did expect perhaps more to come from the war, the Russian war in Ukraine. But certainly I think we're going to see that increase. And how this is going to change our way of evaluating terrorism when it becomes more kinetic, because that really is a long-term reality of cyber. It's not just going to be bring down systems. Increasingly, we're seeing that this can actually result in physical harm, such as a physical explosion. And that is going to be certainly, I think, a weapon of choice because of higher plausible deniability. And it's far cheaper and far easier. So we're going to see a lot more in this space that we need to keep track of. Thank you also for pointing out that politics has become more political motivated. Attacks are increasingly replacing religious ones. That's something we all need to watch for. And while you pointed out, of course, that we are seeing much of this now in conflict-ridden countries, we have to keep in mind that where a lot of this political extremism is growing is actually in the West. So this is going to come home to roost, sadly, for many of us in the West. I suspect that when we reevaluate our numbers as the alt-right continues to rise, as we see increasingly populist movements become more and more fortified in their views. And here again, the link for cyber is disinformation. And increasingly our own enemies, our own adversaries are using the cyber realm against us to sow chaos and divisions within our countries. And so increasingly we're seeing cyber as a tool of terrorism that is going to inflict harm domestically in terms of our societal resilience. So something to watch for us all there too. And of course, how do we balance all that for us in liberal democracies with our civil liberties is important. We never want to, I think, take away our core principles to liberal democracy, but at the same time, how does government in the West think about managing these crises, social crises, without the heavy-handed regulation is going to be something we all need to think about. So lots to chew on. Really, really appreciate it. And lastly, I'll just point out that you did note about lone attacks, which is really, I think, you didn't quite call them lone attackers, but lone wolves is what we used to call them. That is really, I think, quite worrying. And what can we do to prevent these kinds of radicalization? In many ways, when we know there's a group, it's a lot easier to disband, a lot easier to monitor. But, lone wolves, if you will, open up a huge can of worms for us to think about how do we prevent those kinds of attacks without, again, infringing on our civil liberties. So important for us to respect, again, our core fundamental values to liberal democracy. So lots to chew on. Really appreciate the report and looking forward to having more discussions.
Thank you so much, Besma, for your remarks. Something that I took away is that this landscape is becoming increasingly multidimensional. So I'm excited to engage in discussion to see if we can sort of pinpoint ways to find multidimensional solutions. But I'm pleased to hand over the floor to Kyle.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, everyone, for this important discussion. And I also want to thank the Canadian Global Affairs Institute for partnering with it. I'm a fellow there, so it's great to have another Canadian organization be part of this discussion, which I think is needed and is very important. I think your report, this is the third time that I've been involved in doing a Canada launch, and I think it's very important. It can give us the big picture about what's happening across the globe, and led us to really hone in on some key facts. And echoing what Besma said, I think the point that most of these cases of terrorism are taking place in conflict-affected countries is key. Either repression by states that leads to non-state actors taking up weapons and targeting civilians or the government. To me, this is an important lesson, and it shows that we need to improve how peace and stability operations operate, from the UN in Mali to other operations in the Sahel, that we really have to make the protection of civilians a key point of this, and look at ways that we can actually end some of the grievances that result in this form of political violence, be it religiously motivated violence, ideologically motivated violence. The one kind of takeaway for me that I did not expect, did not know, was the case of Myanmar. Myanmar having one of the highest numbers of terrorist attacks. And I just throw this back, is that my institute, we work on genocide prevention, and we had these attacks against the Rohingya, about 5-6 years ago, over 1 million people displaced. But since the Burmese military, the Myanmar military, overthrew the democratically elected government and has put in place martial law and has become the military has retaken control. We now see conflicts growing, not with the Rohingya, but with other ethnic groups across Myanmar. It's not really reported in Western media as much as we should, but we're seeing this conflict and fighting against the military junta take place in many different parts of the country. And I think that's troubling, and that really jumped out at me. I wouldn't have thought Myanmar would have been so high up the list. The other thing that a takeaway for me was the growing instability in the Sahel and in Mali, and how, as I mentioned before, that our peacekeeping and stabilization operations can't seem to really control this. And some of these states are very weak and are unable to either control this effectively, or sometimes react more negatively with violence that targets their own civilians, and that results in these groups growing. I think the case of Mali and Niger are deeply troubling. And another case that was brought up was the growth in overall sub-Saharan Africa, and seeing what's happened. It was mentioned that ISIS is still the most dangerous group, is responsible for the most casualties, but they're not in really that strong as they were in Syria anymore. Explains partly why there are as many attacks in the West, but bringing back the case of Mozambique. Mozambique has seen an insurgency. We don't know who's supplying arms to these groups. We don't know if they're only all from Mozambique or if they're more transnational in nature. And we've seen the inability of Mozambique to actually protect its citizens, to protect the northern Cabo district from this insurgency, and actually Rwanda and South African forces being brought in to try to bring peace and stability to the area. So those are kind of my takeaways, really, the impact on sub-Saharan Africa. But last but not least, what also jumped out at me was the figures about terrorism in the West, and showing that stuff coming from the far left seems to be just as high. They're not as deadly, but I wonder, what's the motivation of these attacks? Are they more, are they groups that are against the rise of far right populism? Are they more aligned with traditional left-wing groups that we saw really impact Europe across, the 1980s? Or are they more eco-terrorists? These are questions that I think I would like to have some answers to or discuss more and more. But maybe my last point, and I see that we have Chris Alexander with us, my last point would be that we can't forget that while some of these figures are going down, the number of deaths might seem quite small, that the humanitarian impact of terrorism is enormous. We have millions of people displaced in the Sahel. We've had 600,000-700,000 people displaced in Mozambique. So these groups can really bring about havoc, displace entire communities or regions of the world. And it leads to enormous constraints on the UN humanitarian operations and on those host governments that have to provide services that they weren't expected in their budget. So it really is also a major threat to peace and security and to the human rights of civilians across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for your remarks and incredible insights on what's happening in a lot of different countries. I love the kind of shift scope that you covered there. Before we hand over to audience Q&A, we've been joined by Minister Chris Alexander. And before I ask you the first question, I wanted to give you the space to give any remarks and your reflections on the current landscape of global terrorism today and any insights from the report that you found.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to do this. Congratulations to all of you who've made this index a reality. Sorry for being late. I am in a different landscape here, quite a few time zones away, I think, from the rest of you. But listen, this is hugely important because it tracks, it gives us a definitive metric for something that affects us all. And I think, as Kyle was saying, as the index itself shows, terrorism is a phenomenon that affects every country in the world. Some countries may not have many victims, direct victims in a given year, but we are all tracking these groups because they are networked. If they're not committing violence in one country, they may be raising funds in that country or recruiting supporters or putting in place the building blocks of ideology, radicalization, and the extremism that we know are prerequisites for these groups to have the effects that they seek to have. And as Kyle says, the costs are enormously high. At the far end of the spectrum, yes, creating hugely acute cases of humanitarian need, of crisis, exacerbating the impacts of climate change, of famine, of drought, of poverty, and all the other forms of dysfunction and adversity that go with conflict and that we know tend to pervade those areas that are in conflict or trying to come out of conflict. But it's also a cost that is imposed on all societies, on free societies, on societies that are trying to graduate to the rule of law, to greater degrees of freedom, to democratic elections, because they represent additional risks to public assembly, risks to moderate free speech, risks to travel and mobility, as we've seen most notoriously after 9/11 with the huge costs that were added to the aviation industry by the reality, the brutal reality of 9/11. And so this is an index that helps us keep up with the times, recognize that we are the numbers of people killed in armed conflict or by terrorism may not be as high as they have been. We are not a world that is free of conflict. And that some of the forms of conflict we've seen are coming full circle. We know that terrorism was a phenomenon that became particularly prevalent in the years before and after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the end of this so-called Cold War, as fewer and fewer interstate conflicts took place and more irregular conflicts, intrastate conflicts took place. Terrorists were often used as proxies by states and became a form of warfare that was pervasive in Africa, in Asia, particularly in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan, and in many parts of the world. Are we today seeing that phenomenon come full circle with Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine? Is Russia resuming its place as one of the state sponsors of terror, as we see shells raining down on cities, accusations, very credible accusations of war crimes, already in a new phase of this conflict? We know that Vladimir Putin, when he was a KGB officer in Dresden in the late 1980s, is thought by quite authoritative accounts of his life to have been funding and a handler to those who were participating in the terrorist acts of that era, including quite possibly the Rote Armee Fraktion. That, as Kyle mentions, European-style terrorism, anti-capitalist terrorism of the 70s morphed into some of the forms of Islamic extremism and terrorism that we saw in South Asia and throughout the Middle East for several decades. And today we see terrorism coming at us in North America, in Europe, and elsewhere through white nationalism and white supremacism and the forms of extremism that have been cultivated, unfortunately, have become the foremost threat to security inside North America, a homegrown threat in these recent years, as we've seen polarization and political extremes go to lengths that we never previously imagined. So the state conflicts of yesterday and today are linked to the terrorist phenomena that we continue to see. This tool is going to help us understand these phenomena. This work is going to continue because obviously one snapshot doesn't give us anything near the picture that we want. And it's going to help us, obviously, to analyze the steps we should be taking in a world that we hope is emerging from a period of isolationism into a more active willingness, determination to confront the sources of conflict, to put terrorism behind us, to resolve the state-to-state wars and conflicts that have been with us for too long, and to embark upon a new era of cooperation, which we know is within reach, if our understanding is correct, if our misunderstandings and prejudices that have prevailed for so long are finally discarded, and if we join hands behind solutions that we know are absolutely possible. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you, and happy to join the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Minister Alexander, and it's great to hear your support for the report, because it is research products like these we hope inform decision makers on their interventions. We're right on time, and to move into audience Q&A, as mentioned, I encourage you to submit your questions in your respective live stream platforms. We'll be able to see all of your comments, but I'm going to go ahead and take moderator's privilege and ask the first question to you, Besma, and Minister Alexander. I think it's also important that we hear your thoughts afterwards as well. But this question is on Afghanistan. So because the Taliban had seized state control back in August 2021, we expect that terrorism deaths attributed to the Taliban will decrease in the next iteration of the GTI. So what is the impact of this transition, and how might it impact Islamic State affiliate groups in the area, such as Islamic State Khorasan? And should counterterrorism interventions shift their thinking? Besma, I hand the floor over to you.
Well, thank you. I'm not an Afghan expert, so take that with a grain of salt. But, I think we'll see. I think there are a lot of specialists of Afghanistan who do believe that in many ways, perhaps the Western presence did aggravate things, and that maybe this is going to be a change to the positive. I don't know. I holding my breath watching Afghanistan. It's very sad to see the Taliban come to power, certainly because of what it means for so many people, particularly, I think, women and girls who are probably suffering the most. But it is indeed, I think, one of the things that breathed a lot of life into ISIS-K or ISK was really the presence of the Americans, and maybe with them gone, we might see a change. And certainly, make no mistake, I'm sure there were always these kinds of implicit understandings that were happening between ISK and with the Taliban government. There's a lot of similarity in terms of ideological views. We can't ignore that. So it is something to watch. I don't think I have an answer, but I'm sure that there will be at least hope that this is going to at least put some change on the ground.
Thank you so much, Besma. Minister Alexander, any thoughts?
Well, unfortunately, with last year's disaster in Afghanistan for the Afghan people, that country has resumed the status it had for 5 years as really, and for some time before 1996, as the world's sort of Olympic stadium or hit parade of terrorist groups. This is the only state now whose regime is controlled by a listed terrorist group, one that whose track record is well documented, whose agenda includes, literally atrocities and crimes against humanity. They've integrated a suicide bombing unit into their armed forces. Who would have imagined in 2021, 22 that would be possible? What will they do with this newfound platform for their fight? Because they really are a group that is dedicated to violence more than anything else. We can't be completely sure. We have seen groups that identified with certain regions, with Turkestan, the homeland of the Uyghurs, with Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan returning to Afghanistan, with the potential to pose a threat to those countries. We have, of course, seen a rivalry start to play out between the Taliban and ISK, and we've seen Al-Qaeda mixed in across the board in Afghanistan with its agenda, which is global and which has hit particularly hard over 2 decades in North America and Europe. So what will be their agenda? We don't know. They're trying to keep people guessing. They're trying to consolidate control. They're trying to gain recognition. But one thing is for certain, it will be a platform for the use of violence, not just against Afghans, which is awful to watch, and we don't get the whole picture because journalists are not able to operate, and freedom of speech is a thing of the past for now in Afghanistan. But let's keep in mind the big picture here. These groups, the Taliban, ISK, Al-Qaeda, are proxies, are creations, are emanations of a broader, deeper, more sinister strategy, which is that of Pakistan's general headquarters, of Pakistan's inter-services intelligence, whose track record in founding these groups and harboring them, in arming them, in recycling them and reviving them after 2001 to fight again in Afghanistan and to fight for a long time and to lie in wait as a negotiating process failed, to pounce as they did last summer, is now well known. So the real question is not what will the terrorists do in Afghanistan? The real question is what will we do about the state sponsor, the principal state sponsor of terrorism that we know has engendered these groups, nourished them, carried them along the way. The Pakistani ambassador to Afghanistan is acting virtually as a head of state, a coordinating power among all of these groups. The dynamic between the Taliban and ISK, the rivalry, is meant to convince us that the Taliban are the good guys and deserve recognition so that they can fight the bad guys. We shouldn't take that bait. We should look to the deeper issues here, which is really a failure of all countries, starting with the United States, to come to grips with, to confront the reality of Pakistan's role in supporting these groups under our noses for a very long time. It's going to be very hard to have a normal, healthy relationship with India or with other democracies in the region until we've sorted out this relationship with Pakistan. The larger issue of China's relationship with Pakistan, their top ally in the world, is also outstanding, as is the relationship between Pakistan and Russia. Putin invaded Ukraine on this full scale that we've just seen now, partly because he saw a weakness from the United States and from NATO last summer. And it wasn't an accident that he was in Moscow on the day this war began. He and Putin see themselves as the two who've really humiliated Western countries over and over again. and taken this agenda of terrorism wherever they wanted it to go. There is a deeper connection between Russia and al-Qaeda that hasn't been fully sorted out. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda today, thought to be living in Pakistan, almost certainly living in Pakistan, spent 6 months in 1997 in Russia before Putin came to power, and emerged from that time in Russian captivity to return to South Asia and join al-Qaeda, which he took in a very anti-American, anti-US direction after that time. Did the Russians push him to do this? Is there a deeper complicity between the post-Soviet FSB, SVR, GRU, and al-Qaeda? That remains to be researched, but I think given recent events, everyone's going to be rehashing the data that we have, the stories that we have, the big picture that we thought we had to try and get it right next time. Pakistan, Russia, Iran are certainly all in relationships with terrorist groups and sometimes state sponsors of terrorism on a scale that deserves everyone's attention.
Excellent, thank you, and thank you for grounding us in the types of questions we should be asking and thinking about these concepts. The next question is from Twitter, and I want to pass this over to Michael and also Kyle. I'm hoping that you can expand on how the conflict in Ukraine will impact the terrorism landscape now that the conflict has started. Any thoughts, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jessica. Yes, I mean, in terms of what we're seeing immediately, I mean, it's always a very, very fluid situation. And Kyle kind of sort of brought this up, and especially when he was referring, for example, to Myanmar, as to when it is that we make the distinction between, you know, terrorism, legitimate actions by a state, or alternatively a variety of different forms of conflict. So, you know, largely what we're seeing currently in, and, you know, terrorism, at least in the way that is measured through our current data sets, is not so much a good or bad. It relates almost exclusively to the specific tactic being used, which currently sort of excludes the open warfare that we would currently be seeing in Russia and Ukraine, for example. But again, one of the things that we do see, not only historically in the Ukraine, and other neighboring countries, but also around the world, is this extensive correlation that exists between increasing levels of conflict and terrorism used as a tactic. So the expectation is that as and if and when conflict continues in Ukraine and Russia, almost independently of what the final outcome will be in some respects, you know, we are likely in reference to that correlation, to see an increase in terrorist activity over the coming years. Kyle.
Thanks, Michael. No, I think there's some questions. When we saw, you know, people that weren't Iraqi or Syrian traveling to join ISIS, they were labeled as terrorists, and some of them were Canadians. Now in Ukraine, we're seeing individuals, some with military experience, some not, going over to fight and to join the Ukrainians. Will they be considered terrorists or freedom fighters? And we're also seeing there's reports coming about how Vladimir Putin says they won't conscript any new Russian soldiers to fight. So, but there's rumors that some mercenaries, a Wagner group, are going to be pulled back from Libya, from the Central African Republic, to fight in Ukraine. And there's also some reports, not sure if they've been verified yet, but also that some fighters from Syria aligned with the Assad regime that might be brought in there. So we're going to have some questions about this, but we're now seeing non-state actors begin to emerge and go into Ukraine and take positions and sides. And that's going to also, I think, change our balance of how do we view this? Well, who's a foreign fighter? Who's a terrorist? I think the thing in Ukraine is going to get much bigger than we'd like to admit.
Thank you so much, Kyle, and thank you for ending right on time. I know we were only able to get through a few questions, and the discussion certainly opens the door for a lot of other topics, but I want to thank everyone who is online with us today for joining this discussion on the launch of the Global Terrorism Index. So the report, the PowerPoint presentation today that was presented by Michael, as well as a briefing that we did on the Ukraine-Russia conflict, they're all available on our website at Vision of Humanity. If you are excited to engage with us further on the findings of the Global Terrorism Index, I want to invite you to our session on Twitter Spaces that will be happening this Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I want to thank all of our presenters and our discussants today, Minister Chris Alexander, Besma Mamani, Cal Matthews, and the entire Migs team for helping put this together, as well as Michael and I. We want to thank you on behalf of the Institute for Economics and Peace. And with that, I leave you, and I hope you all a wonderful rest of your day.